Truc Lam is slowly growing bigger every day, and she has started learning how to observe the world around her, her tiny eyes following every movement, every small change. Seeing that, Trieu Duong realizes his daughter needs a safe little place to sit so she can look around and explore more comfortably. Instead of using anything temporary, he quietly decides to build her a sitting chair with his own hands. Something steady, gentle, and made just for her. But will this small chair be enough to support Truc Lam as she begins discovering the world in her own way? If you enjoy warm father-daughter stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment to support the journey. The morning, light slowly stretched across the small yard, touching everything with a soft, golden warmth. It was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that only comes at the start of a new day in the countryside. Inside the house, baby Truc Lam lay on a thin blanket, her tiny fingers opening and closing as she watched the light move across the ceiling. At just 4 months old, she was already changing in ways that made every day feel different from the last. Trieu Duong sat beside her, one hand resting gently near her small body. Always close enough to protect, never too far to react. He had started noticing something recently, something subtle but impossible to ignore. Truc Lam was no longer as fragile as she had been in her earliest days. Her neck was stronger, her body felt more stable when he carried her, and most of all, her eyes. They were no longer just observing light and shadow. They were searching, curious, trying to understand the world around her. He leaned closer and softly supported her back, helping her rise just a little. Truc Lam wobbled for a moment, her tiny body unsure, but she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned into him, trusting his arm completely. Her head turned slowly toward the doorway where the outside world waited, bright, open, full of movement. That moment stayed with him. He realized that his daughter was growing, not all at once, but steadily, quietly in ways that required him to pay attention. She wasn't ready to sit on her own yet, but she was trying, and that effort, that small attempt to lift herself and look beyond where she lay, meant something important. It meant she needed more support now, not just his arms, but a safe place designed for this new stage of her life. Trieu Duong looked around the house. There were simple ways he could handle it. He could stack pillows, fold blankets, or create a temporary support using what he already had. But the more he thought about it, the more it didn't feel right. Truc Lam was still so small. Her balance wasn't stable yet. One small slip, one moment of inattention, and she could lean too far or lose support. He didn't want her first attempts at sitting to depend on something unstable. If she needed a seat, then he would make one. Not something bought, not something rushed, but something made by his own hands, something shaped with care, built with attention, and created with one purpose: to keep his daughter safe while she began discovering the world from a new perspective. He looked back at Truc Lam. She was staring at him again, her eyes wide and calm, as if she knew he was thinking about her. A small smile appeared on his face. "Just wait a little," he whispered softly. "I'll make something for you." He carefully lifted her into his arms, supporting her head instinctively, even though she had grown stronger. Some habits didn't change, not when they came from love. He held her close for a moment, letting her rest against him, then carried her outside so she could feel the morning air. The yard was simple, quiet, and open. A few wooden tools leaned against the wall. The ground was dry and clean. It was a place where he worked, where he built things slowly, one piece at a time. And today it would become the place where he built something just for her. He chose a spot where the sunlight was gentle and not too harsh. Then he carefully laid Truc Lam down on a soft surface, surrounding her with padding so she would be comfortable and safe. He adjusted her position, checked the angle of her head, and stayed there for a few seconds longer than necessary, just to make sure everything felt right. Even when he stood up, his eyes stayed on her. Only when he was certain she was comfortable did he turn toward the wood. The wooden boards were simple and raw. No polish, no decoration. Just natural material waiting to be shaped into something meaningful. Trieu Duong ran his hand across the surface slowly, feeling every rough edge, every uneven line. To someone else, it might have just been wood, but to him, it was the beginning of something important. He didn't imagine a perfect chair. He imagined his daughter sitting in it. That image guided everything. Before making any cuts, he began measuring carefully. He crouched down and looked toward Truc Lam again, comparing the size of her small body to the dimensions forming in his mind. The chair had to fit her, not too wide, not too narrow. It needed to support her gently without restricting her movement. The backrest had to be firm, but not hard. The seat had to be stable, balanced, and low enough to prevent any risk of tipping. Every detail mattered. He marked the wood slowly, drawing each line with intention. There was no rush in his movements, no shortcuts in his thinking. Each measurement was checked, then checked again. From time to time, he paused and looked over at her. She was awake, watching quietly. It almost felt like she was observing him, as if she knew this was being done for her. The first cut broke the silence of the morning. The sound of the saw moved steadily through the air, controlled, rhythmic, careful. Piece by piece, the wood began to change shape. What had once been rough boards slowly turned into parts of something more defined. A base, side supports, a small back panel. Each piece placed aside with care, as if already holding value. But for Trieu Duong, the work was not just about shaping wood, it was about protecting his daughter. As he worked, his thoughts stayed close to her. He remembered how fragile she had been in the beginning, how carefully he had held her, afraid of even the smallest mistake. And now she was growing stronger, not strong enough to be on her own, but strong enough to begin trying. That trying was what mattered. It meant she was ready to explore, and that meant he had to be ready to protect. He picked up a piece of wood and began sanding it down. The rough surface slowly softened under his hands. He ran his fingers across it again and again, making sure nothing sharp remained. A tiny splinter might seem like nothing, but not for a baby, not for Truc Lam. So he didn't stop when it felt smooth. He continued until it felt gentle. That was how he worked, quietly, carefully, always thinking one step ahead of danger. When the main parts were ready, he began assembling them. He adjusted the angle of the backrest, then paused. It didn't feel right. He stepped back, looked again, then changed it. He tested the base, pressing down from different sides to check its balance. He imagined Truc Lam leaning forward, then to one side, then back again. The chair had to stay steady through all of it. Nothing could be left to chance. Suddenly, a soft sound came from behind him. He turned immediately. Truc Lam had made a small noise, her body shifting slightly. Without hesitation, he put everything down and went straight to her. He knelt beside her, one hand gently resting on her chest, the other softly touching her head. "I'm here," he said. Quietly, her eyes met his, And almost instantly, she calmed. That trust, it meant everything. He adjusted her blanket, making sure she was still comfortable, still safe, still protected. He stayed there for a moment longer, watching her breathe, watching her relax. Only when he was sure she was okay did he return to his work. But now his movements were even more careful than before, because this was no longer just about making a chair. It was about creating a safe place where his daughter could begin her next step, without fear, without risk, and always under his quiet protection. And for Trieu Duong, that was the only thing that mattered. By midday, the sun had risen higher, casting a warmer light across the yard. The quiet morning had slowly turned into a gentle rhythm of work and care. Trieu Duong moved between the unfinished chair and baby Truc Lam, never letting too much time pass without checking on her. No matter how focused he was, part of his attention always remained with his daughter. The chair was beginning to take shape now. What had once been separate pieces of wood were gradually forming into something whole. The base stood firm on the ground. The side supports curved slightly inward, creating a small, protected space. The backrest was already attached, but Trieu Duong wasn't satisfied yet. He kept adjusting it, pressing lightly, stepping back, then leaning in again. He lowered himself to the ground, bringing his eyes level with where Truc Lam's would be when she sat. From that angle, everything looked different. The world felt bigger, the structure felt taller, and every detail became more important. He imagined her small body resting there, her head slightly tilted, her eyes scanning everything around her. Still not right. He reached for his tools again. He carefully loosened the backrest and adjusted the angle just a little, enough to provide more support, but not so much that it forced her into an unnatural position. Then he reinforced the base, adding an extra piece underneath to increase stability. He pressed down again, testing it from every side, no movement. That was what he needed. But he didn't stop there. He ran his hands across every surface again, feeling for anything he might have missed. Even the smallest rough spot could become a problem. He sanded the edges once more, slower this time, more carefully than before. The sound of sandpaper against wood was soft, almost calming, blending into the quiet sounds of the afternoon. Behind him, Truc Lam made a soft cooing sound. He turned immediately. She was awake, her tiny arms moving slightly, her eyes searching for something familiar. The moment she saw him turn, she became still, watching him closely. Trieu Duong smiled and walked over. He crouched beside her and gently placed a finger in her tiny hand. She wrapped her fingers around it without hesitation, her grip surprisingly firm for someone so small. That simple connection made him pause. "You're watching me, aren't you?" he said softly. Her eyes didn't leave his face. For a brief moment, the world felt smaller, just him and her, connected by something deeper than words. It reminded him why he was doing all of this. Not for perfection, not for appearance, but for her comfort, her safety, her growth. He gently stroked her head, then adjusted her position slightly to keep her comfortable. The sunlight had shifted, so he moved a piece of cloth to create a softer shade over her. Every small detail mattered. Only then did he return to the chair. Now came the part that mattered most. He lifted the chair slightly and placed it back down again, checking how it met the ground. He pressed on each corner one by one. Then he applied more force, mimicking movement. Forward, sideways, uneven pressure, still stable. He nodded slightly to himself, but stability alone wasn't enough. He picked up a small piece of wood, and attached it to the front, creating a gentle barrier, something that would help keep Truc Lam from leaning too far forward. It wasn't restrictive, just enough to provide a sense of security. He smoothed it down carefully, making sure it wouldn't press too hard against her body. Then, he stepped back and looked at the chair as a whole. Simple, strong, made with care. He didn't see a piece of furniture. He saw a small space where his daughter would begin sitting on her own, learning balance, discovering a new way to look at the world. A place where she could feel supported, not just physically, but in a way that came from his presence, his attention, and his constant protection. Still, one last thing remained. He took a clean cloth and wiped down every surface, removing any remaining dust. Then he ran his hands across the chair one final time, slower than ever before. This wasn't just checking anymore, it was reassurance. Only when everything felt right did he turn toward Truc Lam. He walked over, his steps slower now, more deliberate. He knelt beside her and gently slid one arm beneath her, lifting her carefully. Even though she had grown stronger, he still held her as if she were delicate, supporting her head, her back, her entire body. He brought her close to his chest for a brief moment. Then he turned toward the chair. "This is for you," he whispered. He lowered himself to the ground and slowly placed Truc Lam into the chair. His hands didn't leave her immediately. One stayed behind her back, the other near her chest, ready to support at any second. For a moment she wobbled slightly. His grip tightened, not enough to restrict her, but enough to protect her if she lost balance. Then something changed. She steadied. Her small body adjusted to the support of the chair. Her back leaned gently against the surface. Her legs rested naturally. Her head lifted just a little higher than before. Trieu Duong didn't move. He watched closely, every muscle ready, every sense focused on her. Truc Lam blinked. Then she looked forward. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the view from this new position. The yard looked different now. The world felt bigger. She wasn't lying down anymore. She wasn't being held. She was sitting, not perfectly, not independently, but enough. And she didn't cry. She didn't struggle. She simply looked. That was enough to make everything worth it. Trieu Duong slowly loosened his support, keeping his hands close but no longer holding her weight. He stayed right in front of her, within reach, within sight. "I'm here," he said quietly. Always the same words, always the same promise. Truc Lam made a soft sound, her eyes moving from one thing to another. Then slowly she looked back at him. For a brief second it felt like she understood. Not the chair, not the effort, but the presence, the protection, the love. Trieu Duong smiled, a quiet, relieved smile. Not proud, not excited, just at peace. Because in that moment, he knew he had done what he needed to do. He had created a small, safe place for his daughter to grow. And as she sat there, supported by something he built with his own hands, he stayed beside her, watching, ready, and always there. Because no matter how much she grew, no matter how far she would one day go, there would always be one constant in her world. Her father, close, quiet, and always protecting her. As Truc Lam grows stronger at just 4 months old, she becomes more curious about the world around her, constantly trying to observe everything beyond her small space. Noticing this change, Trieu Duong realizes she needs a safe and comfortable place to support her early attempts at sitting. Instead of relying on pillows or temporary setups, he decides to build a small sitting chair with his own hands. He carefully measures, cuts, and shapes each piece of wood, focusing on stability, softness, and safety above all else. Every detail reflects his quiet care and protection for his daughter. When the chair is finally finished, he gently places Truc Lam into it. Sitting there supported and calm, she looks around with wide, curious eyes, marking a small but meaningful step in her journey of growing up.